Welcome to Tech Talks. I'm Holly Scott. I am pleased to have Leo Petrossian here with me today. Welcome, Leo.
Thank you, Holly, for having me. Very excited to be here.
So glad to have you. Leo is the CEO of a company called Neurolutions. He's also a serial entrepreneur, MBA, UCLA, MSEE from Arizona State University. I love everything you've been involved with to date, but I will say the real reason I wanted to bring you on today was going back to our time at MedTech Innovator. You shared a very poignant discussion with many entrepreneurs, and I walked away with a lot of interesting takeaways that I thought would be valuable regarding organizational debt.
Yeah, Holly. So that's a good introduction. I'd like to say that recently one of my team members described my management style to a new executive at the company, and it's really stuck with me as an accurate description. And I'd like to frame it and begin with this. They're like, Leo doesn't micromanage you; he micromanages the company. And that's a framework that I really believe in, is what it takes to build a successful company, is for us to take a comprehensive view on our organizations and understand all of the things that influence every dimension of them that can either contribute to our successes or failures. The concept of organizational debt arose from a framework which is just around this idea that when I use the term debt with a person, the first place that they go is that they superimpose the word financial in front of the word debt mentally, and they're like, "What are my debts? What are your debts?" And you're like, "I don't have any debts. My credit cards are paid off." Right? We all sort of think about debt as financial initially, and then amongst engineers or technologists or CTOs or that ilk, you'll hear oftentimes talk about technical debt. And technical debt takes a little bit more explanation to the non-technology side of an organization. What is technical debt? And it's like, oh, well, it's all that stuff that we did not a great job of building the first time, and we know we have to rebuild it. Or it's a couple of things that are sitting behind on revision and whatnot. And we've accrued a backlog of technical work that we need to do for us to get up to date. And the combination of financial debt and technical debt got me sitting down one day and just thinking about what other debts are there that we accrue, that we don't label in an organization. And that brought about this concept of a comprehensive list of organizational debts. And organizational debts can be within your organization, within yourself, and there are things that sit out there. And my point in general is that we need to be aware of all of our debts so that we can pay the interest on them and then pay them down till eventually we don't have any debt. Very often you hear about founders, we were just talking about it briefly earlier this morning, where founders will arbitrage their health for a short period of time, where they will work 20 hours a day for a few weeks and burn themselves out and get into really poor health. Well, they're paying for progress with health debt, excuse me. And so they're going to eventually have to pay that back. So that's what organizational debt is about, is this idea that you accrue debt in multiple dimensions outside of financial and technical, track it, pay it back, be aware of your interest, be aware that you're accumulating.
Yeah, the heightened self-awareness about this topic is empowering for entrepreneurs especially. And, just jumping back to your entrepreneurial journey, because I think it's fascinating. This is, well, tell us a little bit about Neurolutions. First of all, you're the CEO of Neurolutions. Share with us a bit about that.
Yeah, so Neurolutions is a post-stroke therapeutic device company. We market a product called the Ipsy hand. In the US, there's about 800,000 strokes every year, about 650,000 stroke survivors. Of the 650,000 people who survive, about half of them are left with what's called a chronic hemiparesis, or a chronic disability. So about 325,000 people a year are left with a motor dysfunction, typically manifesting as loss of arm function or leg function. Conventional rehabilitation, which is administered within the first 90 days of a stroke discharge, is very effective if done in a timely and effective manner. But typically around 6 months post-stroke, a patient's recovery is said to have plateaued. This is very common, where if somebody had, let's say, 100% arm function before they had their stroke, 60% the next day, They can do rehab. They're at 80% 6 months out. So they're at a 20% deficit on arm function around 6 months in. So conventional wisdom says that rehab is not really going to have much value for this person 6 months plus 6 years, 10 years after they've had that stroke. So we make a device. It's called the IPSI hand, as I mentioned. It is the first FDA cleared brain computer interface or thought activated therapeutic device. It was FDA designated both a breakthrough and a de novo clearance for restoring lost arm function for chronic stroke survivors. So every year, 325,000 people. What that actually looks like is that in the US, you've got somewhere around 8 million stroke survivors, of which about 3 million of them have a disabled upper extremity arm from their stroke. And they had their stroke 1, 2, 5, 10 years ago. So we have a device that helps them regain arm function regardless of how much time has passed since the FDA clear. Oh, sorry, since the stroke clear.
Wow, that's enormous opportunity. Stroke is certainly the big frontier we're following in med tech and seeing the innovation there. And you've been associated with neural technologies throughout your journey, right?
Yes, three of them in a row. I have the absolute, like, the luckiest day of my life was when I met my wife. And my wife, I met her when we lived in Boston, where we were individually living in Boston. She was at Harvard doing her residency and fellowship as a movement disorders neurologist, and her brother's a neurosurgeon who was doing his fellowship at Harvard also. And it was the fact that I spent 3 years, I was not a founder at the time, I was working at a startup. I spent 3 years having dinners with neurologists and neurosurgeons every day, hearing them complain about problems that as an engineer, you're like, that's like 2 hours worth of work to fix that problem. And they're sitting there dealing with it for months on end. And you're like, why are they plagued with such simple things that just applications of some rudimentary technology can fix? And so after that, I was like, okay, there's a lot of opportunity in this neurospace. And so now I've done 3 different neurotech companies. Yeah.
I love seeing that. And we, I grew up in an era where it was all about the heart. We went from
Yeah.
open to interventional, and at the time, going back 30 years, 20 years even, the neurologist was much more conservative in what they would try and really address. So I'm not surprised that your dinner table conversations led you, as being an engineer and a problem solver, to think, man, I could fix that. But it's not just about fixing it, it's about adopting it. So now we have the storm, the perfect storm in the marketplace of where the neurologists are much more open than they ever have been. So great news and great progress with Neurolutions over the last few years. You're really on an expansive mode.
Yeah, we've had a lot of really good luck with Neurolutions. This year, we were awarded a new CMS billing code, category, and fee. So we're able to get out there and fulfill orders for the device. The device is by prescription only. And right now, as you said, it's about driving adoption and awareness and generating additional clinical evidence, because you can never have enough of that. Coming back to the comment you made earlier about it was about cardiology before, right? Then it was very much more about cardiology. It's really fascinating where in the US healthcare system, we spend about $4 trillion a year on healthcare. Of that, 1.1 trillion, if I remember correctly, is attributed to cardiovascular care. So it's a very, very large slug of the total expenditures. US GDP is about $20 trillion. So we spend something like, I don't know, it works out to be about one out of every $20 will go toward, sorry, 5 out of every $20 will go to cardiovascular care. 1 out of every 20 would go to cardiovascular care. And then the budget for neurology care in the US is close to 800 billion, 0.8 trillion. It's a very, very large number. Now, the difference between cardiology and neurology today is that cardiology is asymptoted to that $1.1 trillion. It's at its peak spend level, basically, while neurology is growing. And part of the reason why it's growing is that as Americans, typically we're living longer, and there are more opportunities for people to suffer a neurological disorder of some effect. The other thing about neurological disorders that sets them apart from cardiovascular or cancer, for example, is that they typically don't kill the patient. And so somebody who's diagnosed with epilepsy when they're 8 is going to suffer from epilepsy till they're 88. You have 80 years of patient life to take care of. While that's an uncommon scenario for a cardiovascular or a oncological diagnosis. So neurology has a very, very unique dynamic where it's massively growing. 1 out of every 4 people, I believe, is statistically likely to suffer a neurological disorder at some point in their life. It's very common, getting more common. It's very expensive. We have a huge shortage of physicians. We have a shortage of diagnostics. We have a shortage of therapeutics. It's a massive opportunity area, but it's also simultaneously terrifying. If I could just give one more quick tidbit, one of the most expensive diseases in the world is Alzheimer's disease or dementia, right? And it's becoming more common and prevalent. And there's still no gold standard diagnosis for Alzheimer's disease or dementia. It's autopsy. We still lack a test for it. And then there's still no therapies for it. And then let's go to the condition next to it. That's another severe expense in the neurological space is traumatic brain injury or concussions. And there's still no diagnostics and still no therapeutics. So between those two conditions, you're at nearly 400 billion a year of annual spend in the US. And you're like, wait, what? There's 400 billion a year being spent in a disease state where we have neither diagnoses or therapeutics. That's crazy.
Yep, and going back to patterns of why that happened, and we could spend a whole meeting on this, but going back to behavior and clinical adoption and the willingness. I mean, back in the day, the cardiologists were cowboys. You know, they would try anything, and it was very, very difficult. So if you're pushing uphill, it's only natural to try and go where there's a path of least resistance. So a lot of the emerging tech followed suit where there was some openings. So look, I'm really glad, as you are, that neurology's found its time and place, and we're seeing a lot of attention and growth opportunity in neuro, both invasive from implants to bioelectronics to bioelectric medicine to the sensor-based technologies and the imaging capabilities. It's great. Well, Neurolutions is one to watch, and especially for all of the audience members who are managing their careers and really thinking about where to go. Look for growth sectors, look for experienced leadership team, look for tech you can believe in that the clinicians are looking forward to using, and those are where you can see some real opportunities. So we appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, you raise a really valid point, Holly, on that last part of that statement is one that's super important to me, is that again, I was a first-time founder many, many years ago, and I do still a lot of work with early entrepreneurs and founders and advising and whatnot. And I almost always see that in the eyes of the executive or founding team, that their horizon for their company is FDA clearance. Okay, that is as far as their eyes can see, and everything in their lives is about how do I get FDA clearance, because that is the first like the major milestone. And they have this frankly false belief that it's all hard work and challenges and risks to get through the FDA. And then once we're through the FDA, it all becomes like rainbows, sunshine, and happiness. And we've won, and it's just a matter of time until we get our check, right? Like, and we get paid for the win. That's not the reality, okay? I think that the FDA, especially over the last 10 years, has become, frankly, like I'm like an FDA-ophile. Like, I love the FDA. I love the guidance documents. I love how transparent they are. I love their schedules. I like how predictable it is when you're interacting with the FDA. FDA is not the major risk that defines whether a company is going to be successful or not. It's just a very important, but it's a stepping stone to what is actually successful. And the goal for success is to put it really out there is to become the gold standard diagnostic or therapeutic company in your space. And what drives that at that finish line is adoption. Okay. And you know this from firsthand experience, but adoption is not defined by what your indication for use says. It's not defined by how slick your product is. Adoption is defined by a convergence of, frankly, the payer landscape, the clinical patient flow dynamics, physicians' demand on adoption, and this like montage of things that influence why something will go from just a product to a blockbuster product, right? I can quickly give an example. I'm not citing anything not public here, right? So in the space of EEG, for example, there's a company called BrainScope that maybe 15 years ago developed a disposable EEG electrode array where they were trying to make it be able to diagnose traumatic brain injury. And they got 3 indications for use through the FDA where it was used as an adjunct to CT scanning a person that you suspect of having a traumatic. Okay. Disposable EEG electrode, really nice product, beautiful job. They did great. Company was unsuccessful at the end of the day. Recently, a company called Ceribell developed basically the exact same product. But instead of saying we're going to go after this specific application, they went after a slightly different, an adjacent one, which is the detection of status epilepticus in an ER setting, which is a persistent state of seizure in a typically unconscious patient. You want a quick and dirty way to check, or not dirty, but just a quick way to check, is this unconscious person seizing? And they went after it and they found that, yeah, they gained significant amount of adoption because of this convergence of the billing codes were there, the use case was there, and it had nothing to do with the product or the technology. It was the same technology. It was a low-cost disposable EEG system. It was just that they chose a different market niche to go after with the exact same indication. And that's what defines the difference between success and failure today. It's not your FDA clearance or your IFU so much, at least not my perspective.
No, 100%. I see it firsthand too. We see so many young startups with phenomenal technology. Phenomenal technology. We consider that one pillar. You know, when we think about the product, the market itself. You can have the best product in the world, but if the market's not ready to adopt it, you know, you don't have it. Again, going back, yeah, and I can point to technologies that were tried in neuro and ended up pivoting to cardio because they didn't have the ability to adopt at the time, and now are circling back 15, 20 years later because we've got a different market dynamic. So what a great example with the BrainScope and Ceribell example, because we all know, you know, with their recent IPO, how that road has been.
Yeah, it's gone really, really well.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Where it's like, so I help funds due diligence on startups from time to time, and entrepreneurs always want to talk about the technology or the clinic. And I always begin by completely like throwing that away for a moment. I'm like, great, I will give you 100% credit that your technology works and your clinicals are good. We're done talking about that. Now explain to me why this is a good investment. Okay? Like, without talking to me about technology or clinicals, tell me why is this a good investment? Because that's what we're ultimately trying to do here, is that we're in a sector where we need capital from investors, and investors they want to make good investments. And so ironically, you discover that founders will talk your ear off for 6 hours about their technology. But once you get into like, explain to me how this yields an ROI and IRR, it's like, we'll sell it for more than it cost us to build. And you're like, all right, let's get a little bit deeper in here, right? Let's spend just as much time thinking about the ROI as you do the technology, because we're investing in the ROI, not the technology, right? If we invested, or somebody invested, and you built a bunch of technology and there's no ROI, the technology goes nowhere.
That's right.
Another random thing, like, so in all these conversations, when I talk to other founders, and that I asked them, I'm like, you're giving me a presentation, a pitch deck. I ask you, Holly, and I'm like, Holly, you're pitching Mullings Group to me, or like whatever you are. You're pitching something. I'm like, you're trying to get one idea into my head as your audience, as a CEO pitching an investor. And I always ask people, I'm like, what's that idea that you're trying to like implant into my head? And people will always sit there and be like, oh, that we have a disruptive diagnostic, or there's a really big unmet need for this therapy or this, and they're talking about their product and the technology. And I'm like, that's what I want you to take away from this conversation. I'm like, no, the thing that you want to get into my head is, we are a good investment. Every one of you, every startup, for every investor you're talking to, is just, you're trying to incept the idea. Wow, that's a great investment.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's absolutely 100% true. We see that again all the time. And you and I were we're both fortunate to be involved with the MedTech Innovator Program,
Mhm.
and great segue into your organizational debt framework, because the idea with MedTech Innovator, obviously they're an incredibly well-known technology accelerator in the medical device industry specifically, and this framework, based on your years of being an entrepreneurial, based on all of your successes and other outcomes, right? They're all outcomes, positive, negative, whatever it is. All of your lessons learned. One of the tools that you have put together is this framework of organizational debt. And for our audience, I thought it would be incredibly valuable to, first of all, have the self-awareness around it. You mentioned it in the beginning of our conversation, thinking about your debt in a different way. It's not just financial and technical, because technical debt is also a real thing. So as an entrepreneur, if you're sharing with Holly Entrepreneur, audience of entrepreneurs, this organizational debt, what else should we be thinking about as we think about what we're trading off in those early
Yeah.
days, and when they become important to revisit?
Yeah, that's actually a really two very good points that you raised. Number one is it's about trade-offs that we're making. There's a thing called the engineer's triangle, which is a combination of good, fast, and cheap. And I'm like, Holly, pick any two.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so it's forcing you to choose, and you're like, oh, I want it good and fast. Well, it's not going to be cheap. And so it's about choosing what we're willing to sacrifice for what return. Oftentimes, we end up sacrificing good in exchange for fast. In some places where we think we can get away with it. So, as I mentioned, the first two on my list are financial and technical debts, and these have the importance of being. These are number one important. They're high priority, and typically there's some amount of visibility around these in your organizations. Okay. The other dimensions that I think are really important are the next one on my list is infrastructure debt. And infrastructure can mean anything from physical infrastructure to like your HRIS, IT, tech stack, all of the infrastructure required to run a company, where you know that there are places where you are not doing things the best way. Like, hypothetically speaking, an obvious one may be that you have I'll use a real world example. We let go 5 employees in the last year. Why can I still find email accounts assigned to these 5 identities that have not yet been deleted? We've changed the passwords and logged them out of it, but why is this detritus of IT accruing in the company and not being purged? Or I've promised my employees, this is fictional, I promised my employees a 401k even without matching for 2 years in a row, and I haven't given it to them. Well, this is a partial infrastructure debt that we've accrued. Or the knowledge that I'm like, hey, Holly, are you up on your D&O insurance? And you're like, what's D&O insurance, right? Like, there's a lot of places in our organization where we accrue infrastructure debt. The next one's a really important one for, especially for founders, is what I call credibility debt. Credibility is where if you have infinite credibility, everybody believes everything you say anytime you say it. That's not plausible in the real world. So what we have is imperfect credibility. And over time, our credibility is affected by the rate with which what we say does not come to pass. So if I go to investor ABC fund and I tell them that we're going to do 5 million next year in revenue, and then I see them again and it's 4 million a year next year, then it's 2, and then it's 1. Over the next 6 months, I see them and I give them a different number. Guess what? They're never going to believe a number I say about a future value until it's all they're going to care about and believe is my historicals, because they're like, he doesn't know what he's doing, or he doesn't, we don't understand him. Or if you tell your team, like, hey, don't worry about it, guys. I'll top up everybody with equity after the next financing, and that doesn't come to pass. Well, you've suddenly burned a tremendous amount of credibility with your team, and you've accrued credibility debt. And the important thing is you might think about this credibility debt as like, why is this important? Is that you can go bankrupt with any debt in an organization. You don't like credibility debt can get you bankrupt, and or not financially bankrupt, but credibility bankrupt, which gets you kicked out. You've heard about founders getting kicked out of companies 1,000 times. Why is that? Well, it's because nobody believed what they wanted to do was the right thing to do any longer. They lost all credibility within the organization as it pertained to the overall strategy. Ironically, like for a first time founder, credibility debt is probably one of the most lethal ones out there because they know the least, promise the most, and have the least opportunity to deliver on it. And there's the biggest gap between what they're promising and delivering. And over time, people are going to be like, oh, that person doesn't know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The next one on my list is health debt, which is a really, I always visualize it as concentric circles here, where the center of like a bullseye, like the middle circle is yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, especially those of us that are very ambitious or aggressive or passionate about our work, we will stop exercising or eating healthy. Like I will confess, I was in the office last night and I ate a Snickers bar, and I'm like, why didn't I do that? It was because I was tired and I exchanged some work productivity for some health debt. Is what I did by eating a Snickers in the office, right? So the health idea of health debt is number one is personal. You need to get enough sleep. You need to eat well. You need to get your exercise, get your checkups, right? And when you're in your best shape, you're best positioned to fight for your objectives and your company. So do not think of it as selfishness to take care of yourself. It's actually you're acting in the best interest of this thing, the concentric circles.
Mm-hmm.
So the center of my circle is yourself. And then immediately there's another ring around it, which is the health of your family unit, your spouse and your children. Your spouse and your children, how are you doing around them? And then one more ring, extended family. Then it's your employees and your team. And so basically, it's about how do I act as a nucleus for this bullseye as a pillar of support for all the people that depend on me. And if your pillar's weak, you're going to really suffer.
Mm-hmm. No, I just absolutely love that concept of any one of these pillars, and I'm going to repeat them because I think they're that important. Whether it's financial, technical, infrastructure, credibility, health, relationship, or the unknown, you do mention the unknowns, any of these pillars alone can bankrupt you. And bankrupt you can mean dismantling the success of your organization. So as an entrepreneur, as a business person, I'll even go as far as to say, any of us, if we think about the way we show up career-wise as our individual business, no matter who pays us, okay? We are all an individual business. We're bringing value in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And if we think about our business, it's upon us to be as responsible about our health to debt ratio in these categories as we can, within reason, right? I'm not going to, in seed stage, hire an entire HR team and an IT counselor, right? But that trade-off has got to be recognized and something that we note to pay off later.
Yeah. I have no, like selective use of debt to make progress is unavoidable. It's unimaginable. We have to accrue the debt. My biggest qualm is about the invisibility of it, or that we forget it's there, or that we forget to service the debt. And it's the blind spots that terrify me personally, especially nowadays. As you know, Holly, I've done this a few times. What I'm the most scared of, if I'm ever scared of a situation, is what's called the unknown unknowns, right? The known unknowns you can plan for, mitigate against, design around, but it's anything that's an unknown, a surprise that disrupts all of your plans. That's horrific. You're like, I worked for 7 years just to fail because of what? Like this one thing that I thought was a triviality that I forgot about 4 years ago. How's that even plausible?
Mm-hmm.
Like you, uh, I mean, just think about like IP, for example. Okay. IP is not a day-to-day thing that we think about 8 hours a day, every single day, unless you're literally a legal officer. As a founder executive, you think about it like in snips of time. You're like, here, I thought about it. Then I think about it again in 2 years, right? And you're like, there could be this long period of time where something happens to your IP and you're like, oh my God, I accrued a tremendous amount of debt. Some competitors showed up and they filed patents around mine. I didn't see it, right? And now I have to do something to pay back that debt because I didn't do enough there. So there's a lot of places in the organization where, again, coming back to a theme from earlier, is we have to really micromanage all of these debts and where we're creating value. And if I could just leave with one last tiny thing, which is like the definition of entrepreneurship, which was defined by Harvard, I believe, is the pursuit of opportunity without regard for resources presently controlled. Okay. And debt is just one of those resources that we need to control. Okay. We use it, we'll control it, and we'll use it to pursue the opportunity.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Leo. This is so insightful, and I appreciate you sharing this. It's so good to talk with you always. Always wish we had more time and, again, a glass of wine or something. But thank you for joining us today on Tech Talks. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you for having me. It's been a wonderful session.
Yes. And to all of you in our audience, thanks for joining us on Tech Talks. I'm Holly Scott.